It is a pleasure for me to chair the second one of the day, which is titled Identity, Performativity and Representation. So, you know, those who were there in the last session, I probably asked a very complicated and slightly unkind question to the presenters, but here's another 3-word title that poses lots of challenges and is open to interpretation. Anyway, we will have those interpreted by the 3 speakers in the following order. We're gonna have Theo start us off, and he is speaking to the endless quest for authenticity. I'm abbreviating your titles, guys, where I have it. That's followed by Daniel Mobley. We've got 2 Daniels here, which is very exciting. So Daniel M, who's speaking to performative security discourses. Again, apologies for abbreviating your title. And that is then followed by Daniel Pedersoli. And I'm sure you're gonna give us your updated title, and it's going to be interesting and to the same theme. Originally, I had thought I'm gonna let you speak for 15 minutes and then give you a 3-minute warning, but given that we've got 3 presentations here, I think you can go for 20 minutes, and if you're looking to go much over, I shall interrupt you. If you don't mind, I'm going to do this verbally rather than chatting to you privately, because when that happens to me, it always kicks me out, and I'm thinking, whoa. So I'm not meaning to be rude. I'm meaning to be practical here, if that's okay. That's going to be followed by a Q&A. And those of you who are now in listening and learning mode, can I invite you to already maybe put in the chat questions that you might want to ask, or just say, Christina, I want to ask a question. And that way we can build up a question bank in order to then make the most of the Q&A. I think that will be much appreciated. On the other hand, if you need to digest and if you need a couple of moments to think after all 3 presentations are done, I think that would be good too. On that note, Theo, you've got a PowerPoint.
Yes, I do. Can I try to share it and see if it works?
Yes, please. Do go ahead.
Okay, is it on?
I can see it, yes. So it seems to be working.
Yeah, I apologize. I know it's a bit clunky with both the video and the presentation, but I'm a very visual person, so I need my I need my presentation to help. So thank you, Christina, and thank you for the organization of this panel. So, well, my name is Theo Aiolfi. I'm a 4th-year PhD student at the Uni of Warwick, and I work on populism. But so today, the title of the panel was on performativity, and I apologize because I'll be talking more about performance and performances rather than performativity per se, although, I mean, both of them are completely interconnected. So the paper I'm presenting today is called The Endless Quest for Authenticity, and it's subtitled Populism, Political Performances and Transgression as a Performative Strategy. And I don't know how to, oh, okay. So the question that has been leading my, or at least the statement that has been leading my questioning towards this paper is that beyond their ideological convictions, or whether they're right-wing or left-wing, one common theme around around populist leaders is that they are seen as authentic, as more real than others. And it's something that is surprisingly found not only among the followers of populist leaders, but also in the media and even in academia. So the basic question that I'm going to address throughout this paper and this presentation is that what is specific in populism, which I define as a performative political style, that makes it appear more authentic than other forms of politics? So before I delve into this, I'd like to talk a bit about authenticity as a concept. And it's an incredibly, sometimes frustrating, but also very stimulating concept that is versatile, malleable, with a long history in philosophy. You hear discussions about the authentic self and how to live an authentic life in the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, and it's also applied to to works of art. You see that especially in the work of Walter Benjamin and Adorno, who talk about authenticity in the age of reproduction. And you could extend that more generally to Baudrillard, who talks about simulacres and the idea of the real in the postmodern age. But what is most striking to me about authenticity is that it's commonly defined not in a positive way, but in a negative way. Let's say by contrast to what it's not. What is authentic is what is not fake, what is not artificial, not contrived. And another facet of intersubjectivity, of authenticity that I think is really crucial to my discussion is this notion of intersubjectivity. That authenticity is located, is contingent, it's socially constructed. And I particularly appreciate Peterson's definition of, but authenticity is rather seen as a claim made by or for someone, something, or a performance, and can be either accepted or rejected by relevant others, which leads to the very fascinating corollary question of who are these other people, who are the relevant others that can authenticate a claim to authenticity. And this question of performance and of intersubjectivity will lead me to the core of my discussion, and because my framework is heavily based on theatre and performance, so I hope you'll bear with me with a quick detour on what theatre and authenticity and how they're interconnected. And authenticity is crucial in the notion of theatre, and it's been discussed, debated both in theory and in practice, from the naturalism and psychological realism that you hear most of from Stanislavski, which led to what's now called method acting, which aims to produce authenticity in acting by drawing from the actor's personal experience, thinking about loss when you have to play someone, a character that is experiencing loss, to the more avant-garde and minimal historicism of Bertolt Brecht's epic theatre, in which authenticity is not produced by cathartically engaging in theatre, but by constantly reminding the audience that they are watching theatre through what he calls the Verfremdungseffect, or most often translated as estrangement or distanciation. But although there's disagreement about what is authenticity in theatre and how to produce it, a key factor here is that it also remains subjective. No matter how much directors, actors, and other people responsible of theatre production make a claim in authenticity, it can be rejected or can be deemed authentic or not. And in this case, the audience is in charge of the authentication process. Which leads me to extending a bit this discussion, because of course we don't talk much about theatre here, and my main focus is still on politics. And for this purpose, theatre studies have developed into what we now call performance studies. And performance is a broad notion but can be defined as any action conducted with the intention of being seen by someone else, or more succinctly by Schechner as showing, doing. And for something to be a performance, it needs to meet two necessary conditions. The first one is relationality. So that means that there needs to be two people engaging in a social interaction, no matter if they're present or not. And the second one, reflexivity. That is that these people are self-aware that there's an interaction going on and that this interaction has meaning. And through this kind of framework that is inspired by performance studies, performativity is understood as the ontological effect produced by performances. But, and because such a broad notion of performance includes, of course, theatre and most of what you would consider performance, it also incorporates something called social performances. And social performances is the application of these insights on what is performance to the social realm. And it should be seen as a fundamental component of human interaction, something like what we're doing now, a video conference, ranging to stuff like an intimate discussion with a loved one, court sessions, queue, concerts, anything is social performance in this broad sense. And the person the author that really developed why we are constantly engaging this social theatre is Goffman, a sociologist who talks about impression management. The fact that we constantly need to manage and understand and produce the way other people see us, understand us, which means that we are in constant performance during our interactions with others. I don't want to go too much deeper in the definitions, but I really would like to refer you to Alexander, who talks about fusion and diffusion and how it's linked to this idea of social performances. But to bring it all back to this bigger question of authenticity in social performances, I want to discuss the big difference between artistic performances like theater and social performances. And the key difference here lies in the role that authenticity plays in both. When you go at the theater to see an artistic performances, when you go there, it's based on a rather explicit distinction between artificial fiction and authentic reality. And it's accepted by what we call the suspension of disbelief, the willing suspension of disbelief. And this performance that you go see at the theater takes place in what Bakhtin called a chronotope, a special time and place that is specific of the theater. And while authenticity within the chronotope might be important, it might be important that, for instance, a person playing Hamlet is convincing or look a bit authentic within this chronotope. It is tacitly understood that once the performance is over, there's a return to reality for both actors and audience. Conversely, social performances work very differently. Authenticity in a social performance is its purpose, or rather, a social performance seeks to produce the illusion of authenticity. And because we are in this constant need of socially acting, theatrically engaging with others, we have to act. But because this notion of acting is linked to these acknowledged artificiality of artistic performances, the very idea that the person with whom you're speaking is acting make it sound like it's deceitful or false. And so we end up as social beings to be in this delicate task to show that there's no distinction between the role that we are performing right now and the hypothetical true self within. And this is this authenticity. And in this kind of understanding, social theater is inescapable, and backstage time, the moment where you can drop off your act and stop performing constantly, is scarce. And for this, I'd like to illustrate this with a few quotes, notably by Soward, who talks about representation. And he says that ultimately, a defining feature of a good social performance may be that it does not look like a performance at all. And that all involved need to play along with the idea that this authenticity outweighs the performative aspect. A bit of an older quote, but probably my favorite quote by Judith Butler when she talks about gender. She describes it as a construction that conceals its own genesis, and that's really this whole. I think it points out perfectly how social performances work. This is a shift from the acknowledged artificiality of the artistic to the performed authenticity. And this leads me back to politics. And well, this is an example of a very recent performance. This is Biden and Kamala Harris at the Democratic National Convention, but also more of my case studies, Donald Trump and Melania Trump during the Republican National Convention, which took place a couple of weeks ago. And for this matter, I just want to briefly say that political performances here are seen as a subcategory of social performances that are linked somehow to that imply a political intention, meaning. Just don't want to go too long into this. But now to tie it all back up to this question of that I wanted to tackle, what is specific in populism that make it appear more authentic than other forms of politics? And in order to do that, I need to, of course, put on my sleeves what kind of theoretical approach I use to tackle populism. I don't use the very mainstream or classic understanding of populism as a thin ideology, as it was developed by Mude, for instance. And my approach is based on three kind of tenets, which are that populism is not content-based, doesn't lie in the level of convictions or the sets of belief or ideologies, but it rather lies in the interplay between form and substance. Second, populism is relational. It emerges through the mutually constitutive relationship between actor and audience. And thirdly, populism is intrinsically and distinctively performative, which means that I approach it interdisciplinarily as this concept at the intersection of politics and performance. To be more specific, what sets populism apart specifically in the way I approach it is that I see it as a political style. This approach, which combines performance and politics, was pioneered by Moffitt in a 2016 book, but it's based on Laclau's work, and especially his claim that populist actors do not talk to a pre-existing people, they performatively create it. I see political style, or I understand it as an open-ended repertoire of political performances. And although there's a distinction between the ideological substance of politics and the populist form, I acknowledge that they're interconnected and interacting. And what I find especially interesting with this approach is that it explains or it accounts for what Taggart called populism's empty heart, its alleged superficiality and versatility. So in this approach, I adapt Moffat's categories, and I pinpoint at 3 core performative clusters of how the populist repertoire works. Performances of identity, the people versus the elite, performances of crisis. But today I am going to focus more specifically on performances of transgression and how transgression is a central strategy for populism. What I mean by transgression very quickly is that it's the violation of a social, cultural, or political norm. It's any situation where populist actors voluntarily break conventions for a performative purpose, which bears similarities with other concepts in the literature, most notably Sorensen's disruptive performances. Speaking about transgression, Moffat talks more specifically about bad manners, which he defines as a general disregard for appropriate ways of acting on the political stage, including self-presentation, use of slang, political incorrectness, fashion, or other displays of contempt for usual practices of respectable politics. And his own distinction is based on the work of Pierre Rostigui, who, in addition to the left-right spectrum, adds a new scale of social cultural low and social cultural high. This high being the standard in politics at the place and time that you're studying it. But for instance, in most of the West, you could see that as a developed vocabulary, having a sophisticated understanding of society, a capacity to debate rationally. So, example of bad manners, and the first one that I'm going to be discussing is Kanye West, for instance, which ticks a lot of these bad manners boxes. So not only is he dressed very much differently from any other political candidates that you'll have ever seen, his use of slang, his use of a vocabulary that is based on his hip-hop background is completely different and shows a clear distanciation with other mainstream politicians. But you know, it doesn't have to be that extreme to be bad manners. So another example that you can see frequently here, I'm French, so I use an example from France, but this can be applied to many far left and anti-capitalistic movements. In 2017, Philippe Poutou, in the middle, was the candidate for the anti-capitalistic party in France. And during the debates, he really stood out by not dressing in tuxedo and suit, just like Emmanuel Macron on his left, or any other candidates, but by instead wearing a very simple T-shirt that really is a sign of bad manners, in the sense that he shows his connection with the working people and tries to highlight how disconnected others are. Another kind of
4 minutes left. Sorry, just to let you know.
Thank you. Got it. Another example of this is Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin, who was famous for using slang, using a vocabulary that was very coarse and very abrasive at the time, but also what's interesting is that she also develops an understanding of femininity and a performance of femininity that is very marked and very different from other female politicians, like think of Angela Merkel, think of Margaret Thatcher, that adopt the codes of masculinity even in the way they dress. And last example of bad manners would be undoubtedly Silvio Berlusconi, the former prime minister of Italy, notorious for his excess, for his language that was very coarse, and racism, sexism, all sort of breaking of norms. But where I go further than Moffat on is that I don't think, while bad manners are important and they do encompass a significant subset of transgressive performances, transgressions can go beyond the law. They don't have to rely on being culturally low. And I want to give you a couple of examples. You can think of Bernie Sanders, who, although he does rely on borrowing from the law sometimes, moments where he shows anger that would not be appropriate or not be seen in typical candidates. But a transgression that is not from the law would be his use of the self-label of socialist, which is definitely an anathema in the United States politics, where you can't be seen as a socialist, where it would be seen as promoting an ideology that destroyed millions of lives. So this is a sort of transgression. Another one would be Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte from the Philippines, who, although he does borrow heavily from the law. This pointed middle finger at Obama during in 2012, I think, is a clear example of that. But he was also famous for speaking in his native language instead of a Tagalog, but it was the Filipino standard language, but it was the language of the elite, which is a way of using the high to showcase transgression. And then a third form of transgression would be disrupting the norms of communication. Performing transgression for populism can take the form of using a channel that is unusual or not traditionally seen, which is a way to interact with your audience in a less mediated way and fosters the appearance of a closer and more sustained connection. You could think, for an older example, of Chavez, who spent hours and hours on Allo Presidente on TV, Matteo Salvini, who uses his Instagram to talk about, to showcase his half-naked body, talk about dogs while promoting his xenophobic anti-migrant rhetoric. Or even the most notorious example of them all, Donald Trump, using Twitter as his main, and I won't say exclusive, but at least as his central tool for communication. So the way transgression works is that it showcases the artificiality of the norms of other politicians, and thus the artificiality of their own performances. It brings to the fore the distance between typical citizens and career politicians, and it bridges that gap by talking and dressing like one of the people, like one of us, and thus portray themselves as more authentic. But the limits of the strategy is that first, authentication can be refused if it's a strategic gesture to showcase, but to break a norm. So if your transgressive performance is deemed inauthentic, calculated, contrived, out of character, it can blow back. An example that the English audience will be very familiar with was Ed Miliband's eating of a bacon sandwich that was heavily commented because it supposedly showed him unable to eat like a common folk. Another limit of transgression is the balance between ordinariness and extraordinariness. That is, I think I only have 3 minutes, so I think I'll go a bit further to the more interesting points, but which I think is the paradox of using transgression as a strategy. And using transgressive performances can increase distrust in politics. Although there are short-term benefits for people who show the artificiality of the performances of others, there's a risk, not only in the short run, of making your audience more receptive about your own performances as a populist actor, but in the long run, it risks discrediting the entire political game that populists also play. And finally, there's an ambivalent effect on democratic politics of these transgressive performances. On the one hand, performance of transgression showcase how disconnected mainstream politicians are from the typical citizens. So in a way, it is positive. It shows that maybe there's a need for representative politics to be less disconnected and more palatable. But on the other hand, some performances of transgression can discredit fundamental rules of political conduct. And you see that especially with Bolsonaro, with Trump, where the respect of the other, rational and argumentative debate of opinions can be threatened by this kind of performative strategy. And my conclusion is that, and just to summarize quickly what I said, authenticity is the central purpose of any social performance, and particularly of political performances. These performances of transgression are one of the key performative strategies in populist actors. That doesn't mean we're the only ones who use them, but at least it's a core central element of what makes the populist style populist in the perspective that I defend. And finally, I wanted to showcase that transgressive performances are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it highlights the artificiality of all forms of political performances, but it also includes your own and can raise distrust in politics. And I wanted to raise a more open question of the dangers of challenging the very fabric of a political life that transgression can be. Can you really go that far? Can you really showcase? Can you reach a level of politics that is without performance, without mediation? And thank you very much for your attention.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Theo. That was super stimulating already to kick us off. Can I remind people to, start maybe collecting questions that you have, or just indicate to me that you might have a question, noting them down to yourself on the chat. Meanwhile, I want to invite Daniel Mobley to talk to us about performative security discourses. Daniel, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. I'll try to get sharing here. This should work. There we go. Are we sharing? Excellent. All right. So, I mean, obviously, I'll be talking about performativity as well, but from slightly a different angle, more through a lens of security and securitization theory. But before we get into that, my name is Daniel Mobley. As was said, I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh. And so most of, not all of my work has to do with isolationism in the US during the Vietnam War, particularly isolationism as a performative security discourse. So looking at what isolationism as a discourse can do in terms of what it can construct or reconstruct. So just getting into it here. So kind of utilizing securitization theory, kind of presentation conceptualizes the invocation of isolationism in US foreign policy discourse during the Vietnam War and US involvement in the Vietnam War as a performative security discourse. So isolationism as a discourse rather than a history or some sort of specific foreign policy consisted of performative and often, quite literally self-effacing security practices that reproduced and constituted and historicized these various aspects of US identity and foreign policy through this mechanism of threat construction. So in order to understand these processes, this presentation conceptualizes US foreign policy and identity also as performative discourses, but as kind of more hegemonic discourses which are structured and were reproduced by isolationism as a discourse. So during the Richard Nixon administration, isolationism was presented as this threat, and you see this increase in the use of isolationism and also some changes in how it's used. But specifically that isolationism again was a threat, an existential threat to the US. So the administration securitized the issue via these performative security speech acts. So beginning in 1969, the Nixon administration started recasting the American post-World War II approach as an overextension that could cause the US to rapidly regress to this threatening isolationism. So not only did this isolationism discourse increase, but it started to be directed towards particularly senators that were long accepted as internationalists and this heretofore traditional foreign policy approach. And so these security speech acts designate the limits of a given order by constructing existential threats that both define what is under threat, so a self in this case, and then what this given order is unable to deal with. So this kind of rupture here that is security implies this claim to enact new possibilities. But an acute change to this existing order can challenge these dominant discourses by destabilizing the consistent link between a narrative of identity and the securitization. So, kind of drawing on Nietzsche and Derrida, this presentation theorizes that, securitizations referencing historical foundations or sacrifices in honor of these foundations, like isolationism discourse, operate similar to Derrida's founding acts. So the performative security speech act constructs itself and then also functions as its own constative a priori context. So this context draws on elements of existing identity and aspects of a particular foundational past. So the isolationism is conceptualized as a performative security discourse that reconstructed elements of the national self, particularly the American public, this idea of who they are and an American past as innate and unproblematic through this process of constructing isolationism as a threat during the Nixon administration's prosecution of the US war in Vietnam. The administration's discourse co-constituted the American public as both as font of American exceptionalist greatness and a potential wellspring of existentially threatening isolationism. So just kind of briefly to go over isolationism. So indications of isolationism in US foreign policy, depending on how you look at it, usually starts around the interwar period. And it's represented or constructed many different things. It's seen as a characteristic or a history of the American people, a threat, a moral duty, a foreign policy of specific time periods, something bequeathed from the founding fathers, and most often a pejorative used in different rhetorical attacks. So this kind of concept of a history of isolationism in the US is generally associated with the US staying out of the affairs of Europe, particularly during the interwar period, when it's invoked as a history, as a policy. If you want to call it that, it usually implies some sort of disengagement from the world. Again, typically Europe. I mean, probably the best definition is Roskin's there. It's whatever the speaker wishes it to mean, which is usually something pejorative. It's whatever the user happens to oppose in foreign policy. So the historiography is this tangle of isolationisms and neo-isolationisms and neo-isolationisms, and some of them use as pejoratives, others conceived by scholars to classify these particular political positions. So, I mean, you would think that if there's a new isolationism, there's an old isolationism, but the definition of the old isolationism, they're rarely the same. And then there's also the tendency to discover isolationism in the words of the founding fathers, both by politicians and in the historiography as well. Historians do it from time to time, which kind of historicizes or helps to historicize isolationism as this thing, as this history. And so, in all these founding fathers quotes, I mean, founding fathers never use the term isolationism or isolationist, or kind of lay down these guiding ideological commandments, or anything that was supposed to be a part of some particular historical tradition. It's just kind of reactions to contextual things at the time. And then another kind of brief thing going through securitization theory. So securitization theory is just the idea that something is a security problem when often elites declare it to be so. So security is a speech act. It's not a thing. The utterance itself is the act. The security isn't an object. It's not perception referring to something real that exists independently of the perception. It's a rhetorical structure. So, kind of stripped back to its metal, the securitization is the process of security constructing itself discursively. Saying something is a threat makes it so, broadly conceived. And so if you can think of it as there being a grammar of security, securitization would be, there is this other that is a threat to us as the self. So while the securitizing actor may speak security, securitization is only successful, if you will, if a relevant audience accepts that there's an existential threat to, whichever object itself usually. And generally, this audience is, citizens or voters in the state. And then the securitization generally must be spoken by someone with authority. So that's usually, the position of authority can be thought of kind of relationally. So what empowers someone to speak security is the relationship between the speaker and audience, which is historically contingent and is reperformed with each securitization. And so this kind of grammar or logic that underpins this constitutive power of a security speech act, is what defines this universe of audience imagination and structures the relationships between speaker and audience, the authority involved in the performative construction of security. But this grammar and the relationship, as I said, is historically contingent. So a single speech act is both a function of the discourse and a re-performance of the same discourse. But this the constitutive power distributed behind the discourse, the power to construct security, identity, foreign policy, through security, is again that distribution of power is contingent as well. And so securitization can constitute new meanings. It can construct itself as security. It can define the limits of the threatening other, the threatened self. Through this, the process, it might reperform or reconstruct or reinforce the context within its, that it's constructed within. But it's also intertwined within these larger hegemonic discourses in which it operates and reproduces, and in a sense, empower it, if you will. So again, like Butler's, as was mentioned in the last presentation, like Butler's reading of Sex and Gender, the grammar of security, its constitutive power is co-constituted with and is inseparable from the hegemonic discourses that it's within, if you will. so the securitizing discourses reproduce specific hegemonic discourses and iteratively reestablish them as natural and prediscursive. So the historically contextually contingent relationship is effaced by the construction of the hegemonic discourse as prediscursive or natural, like, you know, again, like in Butler's reading of Sex and Gender. So in the context of US foreign policy, you know, you can think of the hegemonic discourse being conceptualized as, you know, foreign policy discourse, but disciplined by like what actually is called a paradigm of sovereignty. So isolationism discourse, I've conceptualized it as like a basic discourse like Hanson's used. It's situated within a few different hegemonic discourses, but, you know, in terms of foreign policy, a specific one that constitutes objects as foreign through the process that constructs identity and disciplines ambiguity. So, you know, foreign policy reproduces and contains challenges to, you know, this identity. And in the US, you know, these specific historically contingent practices and knowledge, you know, produced an understanding of foreign policy is solely a response to the realm of necessity, to kind of draw from Campbell there. And so a foreign policy discourse in the US holds this privileged position as it elucidates the foremost threats to the nation, the state. And so again, this foreign policy discourse is an effect of this disciplining kind of paradigm of sovereignty. So the historically and contextually contingent process of othering self from other is a method of disciplining this ambiguity derived from a sovereignty anarchy dichotomy. And so in this paradigm, ambiguity is disciplined with recourse to an ideal sovereign presence, you know, actor, group, political community, etc. The invocation of sovereign presence serves as a principle of interpretation, imposing a distinction on the ambiguous, the rational, and thus meaningful versus a dangerous external anarchic problem to be solved, if you will. And so another one of these kind of hegemonic discourses that isolationism discourse is situated within, I mean, in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of identity in the US, is exceptionalism discourse. And so, I mean, there's a whole lot going on here, and I'm just gonna can go through a little bit of it. But so, you know, re-performances of isolationism as a narrative of US identity and as a method of interpretation of US foreign policy has, you know, over the years served to obscure US, you know, to put it euphemistically, forceful participation or just imperialism, if you will, in the rest of the world. So in particular, reproductions of isolationism as a history and foreign policy simultaneously face US imperialism and reify this concept of isolationism. And so the discourse of isolationism as a function of exceptionalism discourse also has enabled the discursive portrayal of the US as a quote unquote like a reluctant hero or superpower after World War II. So in this narrative, isolationism and the allegedly concomitant lack of colonial or imperial aspirations allowed the US to construct itself as a benevolently, you know, shouldering the mantle of international leadership, you know, contrasted against an other of, you know, self-interested European imperialism who only aimed for world power. And so this, you know, exceptionalism is rooted in a liberal and religious kind of morality. There's a interplay there that isolationism discourse co-constituted particularly as a constative and knowable, if you will, or able to be known history of the US in this kind of sovereign, knowable type of way. And so this reluctant superpower discourse constituted internationalists as rational and cosmopolitan against unreasonable provincial isolationists. And so this kind of disciplining function echoes this paradigm of sovereignty discourse mentioned earlier. But isolationism has also been constituted by the same discourses as a rationalist, you know, exceptionalist position. So the position is it's like particular rational one is underpinned by the desire for the US to see other states assert their own liberal rights to self-governance, or religious or moral resolve to protect the US, usually so it'll eventually protect the rights of other people abroad. But all of this kind of affirms and constructs and reproduces this benign, you know, noble intentions of the US in terms of leadership in the international realm.
Okay,
so
3 more minutes.
Okay, so in one sense, isolationism is kind of disciplined by hegemonic discourses as knowable in the context of foreign policy and international realm. This isolationism is understandable in terms of particular histories of the US foreign policy as a result of naivete or ignorance, and constructs a debt to be paid, a sacrifice to be honored, with an appropriately internationally engaged foreign policy. In another sense, there's isolationism as a threat to an unreasonable, irrational approach to the international. In the case of isolationism, the knowledge of a specific history of isolationism in the US foreign policy, and in, if you will, the character of the American public is constituted through discourses that construct isolationism as a known past and a threatening present or future. So as a threat of isolationism is constructed always with some recourse to some prior element of the US past or a latent aspect of a supposed American character. So too is a particular knowable history of isolationism constructed. So since we only got a couple minutes, I'll just skip ahead a bit and just kind of get more to some of the empirical kind of stuff here. So in terms of the Nixon administration, in order to fill this campaign promise of ending the US war in Vietnam, the administration presented a new foreign policy approach they called the Nixon Doctrine, which would justify the US pulling out of Vietnam and turning the war over to South Vietnamese, a process they called Vietnamization. So a key part of this foreign policy approach entailed the US encouraging allies to take a more active role in maintaining their own defenses, particularly in terms of providing their own troops. So the US would still, in some cases, back them with material resources and provide the nuclear umbrella. So as the Nixon administration discourse attempted to present this policy, it was also engaging with these calls by, initially people, in the public, but then increasingly, senators and other kind of foreign policy elites, if you will, to immediately withdraw from Vietnam. And so they were, in the course of presenting this foreign policy, were also characterizing these approaches and the people advocating them as isolationists or those who wanted to introduce a path to isolationism. So within the Nixon administration discourse, there's a subtle shift in isolationist discourse relative to the previous administrations. So there's less of an emphasis on the liberal ideal aspect of American exceptionalism, and instead this exceptionalism is anchored in the idea of an American public, the American public itself, through this discursive emphasis on moral strength or force or power. They use a few different terms. But through this, the American public was constructed as this potential threat to the US. As part of the discursive process, a constative context was constructed to justify the threat. So there's a history of isolationism in this American public, particularly this latent disposition towards isolationism that is just an inherent part of American character. And so the American public as an audience for these securitizations was co-constituted with this particular past, as well as being performatively constructed as the threat, again, predicated on the past and identity that was created in the course of this securitization. So in the, I realize I'm running a little short here on time, but you can kind of see some of this in the Nixon discourse, particularly how while they're blaming or constructing this American public as a threat and as a history and as an identity with this history. At the same time, the Nixon administration kind of played a game here where they're not particularly blaming the American public for the isolation, but blaming these elites that are kind of leading the American public astray. So if you give them the opportunity, if you pull out of Vietnam, they won't be able to help themselves. There'll be isolationism. And so the key to everything in this discourse is this moral strength that if it's chipped away at or if it's crushed, then which would happen if the US pulled out of Vietnam too quickly, then there will just be this rush backwards into isolationism and away from American responsibilities. And so everything, particularly the survival and peace and freedom of the world, will be in trouble. So just kind of quickly to wrap up here, these indications of isolationism in the Nixon administration discourse during US involvement in the Vietnam War constructed, and in many cases reconstructed, this concept of isolationism as a history, in terms justified and in terms threatening and also as a characteristic of the American public. So they are both the audience for the securitization and the threat in the securitization, the threat to the self and the self. And at the same time, this kind of isolationist security discourse was reperforming these discourses of US identity and foreign policy, particularly the knowledge of how this foreign policy and relatedly this US identity was tied in with it should be understood. Thank you. All right. There we go.
Super. Thank you very much. That was a very detailed and patient walking us through and elaboration. That's much appreciated, actually. Well done. And maybe we can pick up on your empirical example a bit more in the questions, because that was quite exciting too. Okay, we're off to Daniel Pedersoli, who has kept his title of Traces of Red and Spectres of Yellow, Catalan and Spanish Identities Through a Deconstructive Look. So Daniel, I'm going to give you the floor, and like the others, please try to stick to 20 minutes. I'll share 3 minutes ahead of. I'm looking forward to listening to your thoughts. The floor is yours.
Hello everyone. Hi. Such a pleasure to be here. As Professor Zeffis said before, and Matt Davies as well, this is pretty much work in progress. So I'm just going to share with you what I've been researching on the topic. So the initial idea from this research came from watching and following the events leading up to the October 1st independence referendum in Catalonia. So I would see the protests, the political battles, and more specifically the attempts to prevent the referendum from being held, from happening, and especially the political representations put forward, both by independent side and by the ones opposing the referendum, presenting each part as a whole as a complete entity captured my attention. So basically, pro-independence parties, pro-independence, or at least pro holding the referendum parties, because there's a slight overlapping in a way. So for this part, Catalonia was presented as an entity, like a full body entity, thriving with intrinsic characteristics, most of them positive. So Catalonia had a particular language, their own institutions, a very original history, and of course there's a date. There always seems to be a date. And for Catalonia, 1714, when Catalans lost the Spanish War of Succession, and King Philippe entered Barcelona. So when Barcelona fell to the other side, and that date, which is approaching, is in 2 days, has become their national date. It's funny that celebrating the defeat, I think there's a lot to it. But then the other side, Spain was itself presented as an entity, as a full body entity. And an interesting part was that whenever Spain was depicted, there was another Catalonia in it. There's always a body, Spain, and the dance, the language, and the culture, etc. And I remember thinking, well, neither seem actually right to me, because there doesn't seem to be like this Catalonia does not seem to exist. Well, neither does this Spain, where Catalonia simply does not exist. There's just as a Spanish state. So so that's where the research began, and I remember so along the way, and I thought like, okay, but how am I going to do this? So I started as a bit like Lean Hansen did in securities practice, but analysing official discourse to try and capture how each part was depicted in at least initially in official discourse. And it's funny because it seems like Catalonia needed the Spanish other in order to construct itself. But Catalonia was also present in Spanish official discourse, but present as an absence. It was not mentioned really. It was official discourse tried to avoid mentioning the name, the dates, the Diada, which is their national day. So Catalonia in Spanish discourse was always there as a spectre, haunting the Spanish self, haunting the Spanish identity, which was presented as something clear-cut and existing as an imminence, but it was never really there. And well, then the aporia, in a way, was like, the more the Spanish official discourse tried to hide the Catalan spectre, the more it became evident. The more the topic disappeared, the hotter discussions were, especially leading up to October, the hotter they were, the hotter confrontations were, the less it appeared in official discourse. And was treated so. So basically, this research takes from Derrida's notions of trace and spectre to analyze these identity traces which ebb and flow and depict each other along the way. As I said, this is very much work in progress, and I hope to hear it from you. But I remember, for example, once walking, let me check on the time, got plenty of time. I will not take 20 minutes though, because this is brief. I remember walking through Barcelona, and one quote captured my attention. In 1842, General Spartero, he said, "For the good of Spain, it's convenient to bomb Barcelona at least once every 50 years." So, and it captured my attention because this Catalan spectre is forever haunting Spain. And digging a bit deeper in Derrida and the notion of his avant-première, one interesting thing I've come across is this idea of a holy 1714, and the way it is constructed as a past. I remember when Derrida said, "The origin has an origin," and it's funny how it's not like the past builds the present. It's the present that builds 1740, builds and rebuilds and reconstructs it. So among all these forces, conflicting forces, this paper tries to take from a bit from what Lean Hansen did, like linking and differentiation processes, to analyze the way the Catalan and Spanish identities build each other, are intertwined, and the way they act as a spectre, haunting each other's identities, and at the same time disguising and masquerading the parts which are unwanted, or which could show a certain sharing of culture or language, etc. So, for example, there's an insistence on the Catalan language, and in a way, an erasure of the Spanish language presence, starting with a name that in Spain, in Catalonia especially, it's never mentioned. It's never called Spanish. It's always Castilian. And another very interesting topic as well is the way Catalans, especially Catalan independentist, the independentist side, they always use the expression, the Spanish state. It's never Spain, because Spain in a way would be a collection. It's always the Spanish state we're fighting against. And it's always against that, the backdrop of that state, of that self, that we build each other. So these escaping identities, never tangible, never existing per se, never prior to interaction. This captured my attention, and this is what I've been dedicating my time to studying. The way official discourse puts forward stabilities and instabilities in constructing and depicting the other, and also the layers that can be found in it. For example, usually Catalan independentist discourse is usually pro-European, so there are multi-layers that are executed when trying to construct the identity. So Catalonia is presented as an entity, as an identity, as a body within the European. So there's overlapping identities. So I want to be independent from Spain, but not out of Europe. So this melting pot of nationalism and identity has captured my attention, and that's where I'm putting my time and effort to understanding. So thank you very, very much. It took me like 12, 13 minutes. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope to. It's such a pleasure to be with names I would read in my college days. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That was a good introduction in what you're interested in your research, and I think we will probably have some good questions for you to shed more light on more detail of what you're trying to research. So thanks to all three speakers. So far, I haven't had any kind of wild waving or chat messages that somebody wants to urgently ask a question. So I'm not yet going to abuse my position as a chair, because I want to give you all a bit of time to think about it. I also especially want to invite the PhD students amongst you to take the opportunity to actually have a conversation amongst yourselves, and not just wait for, the kind of older and not necessarily wiser in the room. But asking colleagues nonetheless to also think about offering advice and questions. So can I prioritize the PhD students amongst you to maybe think about each other's projects? Because I think doing research is hard and thinking is hard, and so we can all benefit from each other's engagement. Hattie.
Yeah. Right. Hello, everybody. So I had a couple of questions. One for Daniel Pedersoli, sorry, and then one for Theo as well. I'll start with Theo's because it's a bit of a silly question, so I do apologise. Basically, I was kind of struck by, when you were talking, all of the examples of politicians that you used were people that kind of expected to win, or at least win on some sort of national scale or something like this. You know, it was quite important. It was very interesting, kind of like framing this populist strategy as, if that's a good way of framing it, as a vote-winning strategy. I'm kind of interested to think about it, or to think about what this does for your framing of populism from the perspective of something like Lord Buckethead, who, if you're not familiar, to everybody that's not familiar with British politics, he's a joke candidate, right, that stands against, I think, against the Prime Minister. I'm not the person running for Prime Minister in their constituency. I'm not 100% sure how Lord Buckethead actually functions. But he is ridiculous, right? So it seems to me that he's doing a lot of he, by the way, wears a bin on his head and a cape and makes all of these great pronouncements and stuff. It's supposed to be comedic, but it seems to be doing a lot of the same sort of things as a lot of your you know, I can't remember your terminology, I apologize, but the different, you know, the ways of going against norms and things like that, political norms. So that was, yeah, that's my silly question to Theo. And then to Daniel, I find the idea of these kind of the two identities sort of happening at the same time in Barcelona very interesting. I don't know if there's anything kind of material going on about sort of the way that you'll find Barcelona and Spain and Catalonia kind of like happening in the same place at the same time, but that you can't, you know, it's kind of a poorly formed question, but what I'm trying to talk about is the kind of like, how do people perceive, how does the space come about of it? Is there anything, how do we sense that this is not Spain, or are there material markers that this is Spain, that this is that this is Catalonia, that sort of thing? Is there something going on there with the spectres of those two things interlinking? But yeah.
Okay. As I'm not seeing any hands at the moment, also if you're wanting to ask a question but want to remain anonymous, feel free to send a chat to me. Anyway, Theo,
yeah,
why don't you start with answering?
Thank you, Hattie. It's such an interesting question. Yeah, I'm familiar with Lord Buckethead, and he's quite a fascinating figure. I think what you say is very interesting. I want to stress first that to answer briefly that transgression is not the only part of what draws appeal. So you can be transgressive while it's not being successful, and I'm not even saying that transgression makes you successful, but the question of joke candidate is really making me think. In many ways, someone like Kanye West can be seen as a joke candidate, and he's definitely not serious in the sense, you know, he's missed like 2/3 of registration dates for states. He's never going to win. So and you know, even Donald Trump at first was initially seen as a joke candidate, and for a very long time he was seen as not a credible, serious contender. So if you were to ask me what's the difference between these, I think it's interesting. I think first you should distinguish between, you know, self-aware and not self-aware joke candidates. I think Kanye West is not very self-aware. I think he genuinely believes that he's going to change America, and I think Trump is not very self-aware. I think Sir Buckethead is definitely more on the self-aware side, and I think this kind of candidate is not trying to actively win, but rather trying to prove the absurdity of parts of the electoral process, which reminds me in some way of Pastafarianism. You know, this kind of, I won't say fake religion, this religion, but it was created to mock creationism and to mock the influence of other more established religions, and to show how, yeah, I want to believe that a spaghetti noodle monster is my God. What are you going to do about it? And what does that imply for practical policy? So I think, I mean, I don't know him. Maybe he genuinely believes it, but I think this is more of an actor trying to showcase some of the absurdity of electoral politics, rather than a politician aspiring to represent the people or to do something like this. So that's where I would put the distinction. But it's so interesting. I need to look more into this. Thank you.
Brilliant. Daniel, do you want to answer quickly?
Well, thanks for your question, Hattie. Not sure I completely understand it though, but let me see. You wanted to know, like, how is it different? Spain and how does Barcelona and Catalonia depict and present themselves as different? Is it?
Do you want me to repeat it, but try and word it slightly better?
If you could, otherwise I run the risk of giving it like a general answer.
Sure. So kind of what I'm thinking of is what you've mentioned is a lot of, when you're there, you talk a lot about the discourses, but you also have mentioned a few things that you kind of noticed by being on the streets. You know, so that you've seen a certain sign saying this, you know, etc. And I was wondering if there's, if you think that you can kind of sense and feel these aspects of being within Spain or Catalonia within the same space.
Right. Well, particularly speaking, yes, I could. I could sense there's not only like a difference, a sense of being in a different place. There is a present and constant differentiation process. Well, it's already very, very, very known that post-Franco, the post-Franco years, like since 1975 and the redemocratization process, there's been like a revival of national or nationalist or sub-national feeling in Spain. So not just in Catalonia, but in Galicia, in Euskadi, the Basque country. So many prohibitions were lifted, starting with the use of language that remained prohibited for 40 years. So the very first generation to go to school in Catalan, they are now in their 40s. So basically, they never spoke Catalan apart of their acquaintances. So, and not just that, like street signs, place indications, official communication. If you watch Pasqual Maragall's Barcelona mayor during the Olympics, 1992 Olympics, he spoke first in Catalan. So there's an attempt to prioritize Catalan. But there are some traces and some lingering aspects, for example, which are very well studied. The Catalans, they relate to the law, to the juridical system, mostly in Castilian, because that's the language of the police. And when you're in the streets, it's people usually answer you back in Castilian and in Spanish. So. And there are lots of institutions, for example, Platform for the Language, which try and foster the use of Catalan. I could see a constant attempt to differentiate, but at the same time, never really managing, because these identities are overlapping and they have multiple contact points. So again, this is like my experience and my research. But what's striking and it's very interesting for me to see is not really the differences or the street signs and language and communication, but the way these identities are put forward, are constructed as different, as very different, as clear cut, as starkly different identities, and the way some points are erased or silenced in detriment of others. That's what really gets me in these, and it goes in multiple directions. Official discourse, cartoons, children's cartoons, and journal, newspapers, basically like in every direction.
Thank you. That's helpful. I think, Hattie, you'll agree. I now have Patrick, Who wants to? Patrick Pinkerton, that is. I'm not sure if Patrick Hughes wants to ask questions too, feel free. But in this case, it's Patrick Pinkerton. And then I've got Maya, who also wants to ask questions. We have just under 20 minutes left. So we're not rushing. So anyway, Patrick, why don't you start?
Okay, great, thanks. I really enjoyed all the presentations. So maybe just say I like observation for Daniel Pedersoli. So yeah, well, I've been to Barcelona twice. The first time, or the most time quite recently, the two things I just saw, the two things that were most prominent in the city was the kind of yellow ribbon for independence, then like a Lionel Messi shirt. I don't know if that's changed now with Messi, but anyway, they were the two most prominent things. I think the time before I went to like a Catalan National Museum, and one of the striking things when they had like a timeline of events in Catalan history, and they just would leave out entire centuries when I guess there was nothing that they could put in to promote the idea of Catalan national identity. So just yeah, those interesting observations. Well, maybe interesting, but observations no less. I had a more specific question for Daniel Mobley. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I really liked the idea, or this really interesting point you raised at the end about how the American public being both the kind of audience of this securitizing maneuver, but also the threat being constructed. And I guess my question, so I guess because you're looking at this historical example of the kind of Nixon era, so when we're looking at, if you're looking at historical examples of sort of securitization maneuver, that allows us to ask the question, in your research, do you think this was successful, or indeed, if not successful, what repercussions did that kind of securitizing maneuver have? And then maybe just very briefly for Theo as well, I really like this idea. Well, I guess one point you mentioned that I would maybe, if you could speak a bit more about, the idea of authentication. So you're talking a lot about authenticity and the difference, authenticity versus artificiality and so on. But at one point you mentioned authentication. So, if there is a process of authentication, who is the authentic, and whatever the person who does the authenticating, who pulls something out as false. So if there's any further results you have on that, would be interesting to hear.
Speakers, is it okay if we collect? So I bring Maya in now, or do you want to answer because you don't really want to do multitasking? Don't care? Okay, I think Maya, in that case, why don't you come in, and then we can take it from there.
Okay, so my question is also for Daniel Mobley. I think you're onto something really, really interesting in your project. I've always been fascinated by how Americans succeed in embracing or celebrating isolationism, all while intervening the world over. So there's clearly something to be explained and explored here. But I confess, whilst listening to you, I was suffering a certain amount of theoretical vertigo, if I can put it that way. So I didn't quite get to the bottom as to where you stand theoretically in the end. So there were quite a lot of theorists at the party, as it were. And so I suppose I have two specific questions. One is to do with this idea of isolationism as a founding myth and putting it in relation to Derrida's idea of a founding act, which to me, Derrida's idea of a founding act is a logical relationship. It's something where I can't have the thing without having had the founding act. So it's kind of this loop thing, and you know about this. Whereas a founding myth is to me something slightly different. So I clearly didn't quite get what you were doing there. And the other thing is sort of a broader question. I just kept being confused because you kept saying securitization theory and then Derrida and then securitization theory. And to me, the two don't seem to be compatible, and you seem to think they are. And I suppose, you know, my basic query here is that the Copenhagen version of securitization theory, in as much as I understand it, approves of speech act theory. In fact, is based on speech act theory, whereas Derrida has put quite a lot of effort into sort of revealing speech act theory as really not functioning in the way they think it does. So how does that work?
Brilliant, thank you. Shall we start with Daniel Mobley to answer, and then Theo, and then Daniel Pedersoli? Does that work? Yeah. Okay. If you each take 3 at absolute most 4 minutes, and if you're going beyond the time that we have, I'll cut you off, not meaning to be impolite.
All right. Well, thank you for your questions. So I'll start with Patrick's first. In terms of whether it was the securitizations were successful, I mean, it's a difficult thing trying to say what's successful or not, because it kind of depends on trying to determine what their intentions were. I mean, I think you could possibly say that kind of throwing around isolationism like that maybe worked in the short term. I mean, because he did Vietnamization as he wanted to, but you could maybe think about it not working in the longer term, because afterwards, I mean, there was this kind of slightly pulling back from the world. So, I mean, you could say that, people didn't really listen to the fact that isolationism was this big threat. They did indeed kind of pull back from the world as a reaction maybe to, Vietnam, and particularly kind of domestic backlash. So, I mean, in terms of, his politicking in the short term, it seems to have at least kind of, staved everything off, because he achieved a lot of what he wanted to, and he won the election quite handily. Maybe things turned out differently with Nixon. I don't know. Who knows how that could have worked out. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. Yeah. So moving on to the theoretical vertigo. Yeah. So there's definitely kind of a lot of moving pieces here, which I guess I didn't really kind of get across the relationships quite as well. So in kind of moving to your second question first, I mean, obviously, yeah, the Copenhagen School thing, securitization is, I mean, it's all about speech act theory. But I mean, the way that I, try to use securitization theory, and, is in many ways kind of a critique of that Copenhagen School kind of thing, like trying to move beyond just a focus on, individual speech acts, more so as kind of broader discourses. So in that sense, I mean, I think, I mean, I'm not trying to, borrow everything from Derrida, mainly the kind of the founding act kind of thing. So in terms of the founding act, so, a lot of the way he used it initially was in terms of the Declaration of Independence, obviously. And, in writing that, you sign with authority you don't have, but in signing it, you create that authority. So the way I kind of use it, perhaps the myth, and saying myth was a bit misleading. I think I was kind of trying to point more to its constructedness, but the way I kind of use it, particularly in terms of, post-World War II, and particularly when you get into the Truman Doctrine and after NSC 68, when, the serious Cold War, global engagement stuff starts to take effect in the US, kind of using this idea of a sacrifice in World War II, and there being this, new kind of liberal world order, and the US being the leader of that against these, forces of communism, that kind of, in declaring, that, there are these communist forces that are a threat to us, so we can't draw in on ourselves. You are kind of, or they are constructing this founding act of, sacrifice in World War II, and this kind of leadership having to fall onto the shoulders of the US. So in the act of securitizing isolationism, I mean, you're kind of, it relies on and constructs the idea that, you know, this is how the international works now, this is where our place is, and it's all based on this history, which also kind of stretched back, you know, to the founding fathers and stuff like that. You know, we have this in our history, it's this bad thing that we overcome when we learned this lesson. And so it's a process of constructing that in the process of securitizing these things, which, you know, is kind of creating a lot of things, but it's all kind of predicated on particularly a post-World War II kind of founding act like this, you know, made us who we are now. But to a degree kind of stretches back to this idea that the US was isolationist and it had this kind of isolationist DNA. So I don't know if that addressed your question fully, or but thank you, I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Maya and Patrick. Theo, do you want to take your 3 minutes or so?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this question on authentication. This is definitely the least explored part. I'm usually more focused of my research. I'm usually more focused on performance production than in performance reception, but it's a fascinating topic. I think when it comes to authenticity, each claim to authenticity is heavily specific and contextualized. You know, we could talk about Thai cuisine and say, is this pad Thai authentic? In this case, the people in charge of the authentication could be, you know, Thai people, experts in food, people who ate a variety of Thai dishes. During my research, I read a lot on authenticity in country music and what makes country artists authentic. And again, there's variety of people that can be. It's fascinating, but it's extremely complex. As for political performances, as for all the others, the authentication process is multifaceted. Pragmatically speaking, after elections, votes can be seen as a broad marker of the success, but you know, this applies more to the general overall performance of a political actor rather than to the authentic claim of one specific action. You know, I don't think Ed Miliband, you know, to go back to this example, lost the election to this infamous bacon sandwich story. But to go back to the authentication process of these specific moments, you know, this sandwich story, I think the authentication here is diffuse and located in the hands of many actors. Certainly national media play a central role. You know, the fact that the London Evening Standard and tabloids took hold of this story and published it everywhere definitely is part of this authentication process. But, you know, even if some members of the target audience interpret a claim as authentic, some others may not. And I think, for instance, of social networks that have an important role in bringing some, in this authentication process, memes can be created. You can think of Theresa May doing the awkward dance. Some people, at some point, the authentication process takes a life of its own, and tracing it would be fascinating, but extremely complex. And I don't know if it would be important to focus on, you know, each specific instance or on the overall performance for an election, but definitely something to look more into. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Daniel, maybe, do you have a response to Patrick's observation, or is this something that you want to take away and think about in 2 minutes to at most 3 minutes?
Right. No. Thank you for the observation, Patrick. And what strikes me is like the semiotic side of it, which is quite interesting, and it's praised in different sides. For example, just like an observation, like 2 or 3 years ago, the final match of the South American Cup could not be held in South America. There were riots, etc. It was transferred to Madrid. Still don't know why, because it's called the Liberators Cup, and it was transferred to Madrid. Anyway, one of the teams, one of the Boca Juniors, yellow is their color as well, so it's yellow and blue. So many of the supporters, they had yellow scarves because they were supporters of Boca Juniors, and they were, and these scarves were the police went to fetch those scarves and prevent them from entering the stadium with the yellow scarves, because there was such a complete and sheer fear of everything that resembled yellow, and they could not enter the stadium with their yellow Boca Juniors scarves, because they were taken. They were mistaken as Catalan independence supporters. So this is very interesting, and it, another aspect is that it's intersectional, because there's left and right both in Spain and in the Catalan Parliament, and there is monarchy and republic. So there's the Republican side to it. So some Catalan parties believe Catalonia need not be independent, but Spain should be federalized. So many forces fighting for the prevalence here, and all of them trying to depict both Catalonia and Spain in a way, and that's what I hope to address much better throughout the research. Thank you.
Talk about brilliant timing and timekeeping. Okay, so we have exactly 1 minute to go for our slots. I want to say a big massive thank you to our 3 speakers.